In this video, I'm going to give you my thoughts on Viltrox's Pro line of lenses for the Fujifilm X system. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to chat about Viltrox lenses, specifically the Pro line of lenses. Now, Viltrox started their journey into the Fujifilm X system with a set of fast aperture, stepping motor driven, basic focal lengths. Now, they weren't the sharpest or most aberration-free lenses, but they did get people very excited because of their use of stepping motors over Fujifilm's DC-driven fast aperture lenses. Now, I tried the 23mm and the 56mm versions of those lenses, and honestly, they weren't very good optically. Viltrox has now split their offerings into two lines. The first is the Air series of small, light, budget-friendly lenses that have slightly slower apertures, and the second is the high-end, fast aperture, no-holds-barred Pro series that aims to take on Fujifilm and of course other manufacturers at their own game and create a series of lenses good enough for the demands of the working photographer. In this video, I want to give a quick introduction to each of the lenses in the Pro line so far, quickly go over their strengths and weaknesses, and see how they fit together into a set. And then I want to discuss what I hope to see in the future from this series. I've got all three of these lenses here, in large part thanks to Viltrox for supplying them for review. The 27mm and the 56mm were provided by their marketing department for initial review, and my agreement with them regarding those lenses is over. They have no idea that I'm making this video, but I do hope that they'll watch it. As for the 75mm, I purchased that with my own money very close to its release date, and I haven't got around to reviewing it by itself yet, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. This video was actually inspired by the number of comments I got on my recent 56mm Pro review, asking me to compare that 56mm and the 75mm in terms of sharpness and bokeh. And also, quite a few people asked which one of them they should buy. Now, I find this a bit of a curious idea because they're completely different lenses that work in very different scenarios. Now, I understand that people may want to invest in only one of them for their work, but the reality is that they're so different in their applications, much like the 27mm and 56mm are, that there are so many more important considerations than simply detail and bokeh rendering. Now, hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be able to see how one of these lenses might slot into your kit, or if perhaps you'd be better served by the 27mm instead of one of them. In order to get an idea of how each lens renders in the same situation, I did a simple portrait of my wife in a cafe to see how both she and the background changed with each lens. Now, the goal here was to create a very similar portrait, with her remaining pretty much the same size, to see how things like perspective distortion affect the image. Okay. First, let's look at them side by side, and then I'll dissect each one in turn. Looking first at the 27mm frame, what you can see is that because of the wider field of view, I've had to get much closer to her in order to keep her relatively large in the frame. The knock-on effects of this are that the background now feels relatively further away, and the parts of her that are close to the camera, such as her shoulder, feel a little bit closer than they should. Now, if you look at the cup in the bottom left corner, you'll also notice that it feels a little bit stretched, and you can definitely see that the camera is placed a little bit higher than the other two images because we're able to see into the cup clearly. Now, this was simply a factor of the space we were in and the position that I had to be in to take this picture. Overall though, these factors have the combined effect of making an image that feels like we are up close and personal with the subject. Also, because of my position and the wider field of view, we're able to see much more of that background, including showing that the windows recede into the back of the room. The leading lines feel a lot more three-dimensional than the other two images, and there is a sense of space and depth. If we move on to the 56mm, much of that feeling of depth is reduced and effectively flattened because I've had to step much further back from the subject in order to keep her the same size in the frame. We're no longer able to get a real sense of how much space there is around or behind her, and her features feel much flatter and more proportioned like they are in reality. This is one of the key reasons that people consider this focal length to be the quote-unquote portrait focal length. There are still slight gaps between the windows that allow us to get a peek outside, but we lose much of that in this frame. The background also now feels much closer, much flatter, and we can't really get a sense of just how deep the room is from this image. Things feel compressed. The effect of that on the leading lines in the roof and the receding windows gives a little bit more anonymity to the space and a bit more focus on the subject in this case. And finally, let's look at the 75mm. Here we see the effects that the 56mm had, but they're amplified once again. The first thing that jumps out to me is just how impersonal and far away from the subject this image feels. It's almost starting to feel vicarious, and if I'd asked her to look out the window rather than at me, we may have completely lost that connection, and it could have started to feel like a stolen moment. Then there's just how flat everything feels. There's very little in the way of depth cues left here, and it's almost like we've cut her out and pasted a background in behind. The view out of the windows is gone, as is the receding nature of those vertical lines. By virtue of the position that I've had to be in to photograph this, they've basically just been effectively stacked on top of each other with no space in between. The diagonal line of the light on the ceiling is now just a diagonal line. It no longer carries that feeling of depth that it did with the 27mm lens. Now let's examine a few technical differences in the rendering of these lenses. Now, firstly, there's the color of their rendering. Now, much like with Fujifilm's lenses, the warmest of them is the 56mm, and this makes sense as its primary use for a lot of photographers is going to be some sort of portraiture. And as a general rule, warmer portraits tend to make people look a little more alive than colder ones. So it brings a good starting point to your images. The coolest lens seems to actually be the 75mm, which feels a lot more blue than the other two. And then the 27mm feels the most neutral to me. But boy, are we splitting some insignificant hairs here. If you want perfectly matching colors across lenses, a few moments in post-production will sort that out. Next, the single most important comparison in the comments section: sharpness. Before we even look at that, however, I'm going to say this. Every one of these lenses is perfectly sharp enough for the needs of everyone but those whose sole desire is to examine images at 500% magnification. They're all very, very good. But we'll split some hairs here and keep the pixel peepers happy. Side by side, we see that the 27mm appears just a little sharper in the center, but it's really not an amount worth considering on a full image level. When it comes to the corners, the 56mm seems to be the best of the bunch, but again, it's a margin that doesn't really matter. Now by f1.4, all three lenses sharpen up and show a bit more contrast, and by this stage, they're in line with each other, and the bottom line is, they're very, very good lenses, and there's nothing significant to distinguish them. Now, in terms of flare and ghosting, none of these lenses performs particularly well, and this is an area where I would say their Pro nomenclature slightly falls apart. Each lens suffers quite badly in its own way, but the common factor is having a strong light source just outside of the visible frame. In this case, each of the lenses immediately fails in its correction for flare and ghosting. Aside from that, however, they're quite good. The 27mm and 75mm can be used to good effect in certain ways, but I haven't found any angles where the 56mm produces any sort of pleasing flare result. Now, that's not to say there aren't any though. The 27mm wide open produces this beautiful ray with the sun in the frame. I've used it in quite a few images and I really, really like it. The 75mm at very, very specific angles with slightly softer light coming through clouds or haze is able to produce this blooming effect as well, which I really, really like. Now, the bokeh. As you can see here, the bokeh coming from each of these lenses is quite similar. Of course, the magnification of the longer lenses makes the out of focus specular highlights appear a bit larger, but the overall shape and quality is very similar. All three lenses have 11-bladed apertures, so the shape remains consistent as we stop them down as well. All three also display a little cat's eye towards the corners, indicating a little swirl to be present in the bokeh. All three show a bit of chromatic aberration around the edges of the bokeh as well. So you can see that Viltrox has kept the bokeh of these lenses very consistent across the focal lengths, and that plays out in real-world shooting as well. They all render in a very similar way. Now, they're quite a bit different from their Fujifilm counterparts, and they stand out a little bit when compared to those. But if you're going to just be using Viltrox lenses, they make a beautiful set. Viltrox has done a really, really great job with this. Now that we're done with some technical comparisons, and hopefully you can see that they're all very, very good lenses, I want to talk a little bit about what's really important here, and that is what each of these lenses is actually useful for and where it shines. Let's start with the 27mm. This, as I see it, is the sort of general purpose jack-of-all-trades lens. It's one of those lenses that you can just take out of the house as your only lens, and you know that you're going to be covered for most things. It renders a little bit of perspective distortion when you get in close, but it's still useful for a close-up portrait, for example, or shots of your food, as long as you pay attention to that perspective distortion and take it into account. It's also a great street photography lens because it gives you that wide but not wide feeling to the images and allows you to get in close and give the feeling of being there while still showing plenty of context. A great way to use this lens is wide open in this context. It's very easy to achieve a three-dimensional feeling to the rendering in this way. It's also great for giving a sense of space, as I discussed in the first section. Receding lines have a definite direction to them, and things that are close to the lens feel close. By far though, my favorite use of this lens is for getting subtly shallow depth of field at a distance. Now when you're about 5 or 10 meters from your subject, the shallow depth of field is not immediately noticeable unless you look for it, but it brings the subject off the background and that lovely vignette just pulls you right into the middle of the frame. This is the real power of the 27mm for me. Now moving on to the 56mm. This focal length is where perspective distortion really isn't a factor at regular working distances. If you make a head and shoulders portrait, for example, the subject's proportions will remain as they should be. For a beauty shot, this is an absolutely wonderful tool, and it gives the sense that the photographer is still present with the subject and not too far away, but it also flatters the features at the same time. It's an excellent balance for this type of photography. The working distance and the narrower field of view also make it easier to keep straight lines straight. Slight tilts of the camera in any direction have less of an effect on the lines of the image, which means that you can be a little more carefree and still have images that don't feel off. The 56mm is also great as a walk-around lens because it allows a much more compressed feeling to the images. You can step back quite a bit and use that distance to frame your subject with other elements in the scene really easily. Once you start getting in close, the 56mm is the one that will make your images stand out from the masses, especially when it comes to things like the phone photos we see flooding our sensors these days. With its fast aperture and tight field of view, I see the 56mm as being sort of the equivalent of slide film in the digital age. Everything that you point it at just feels a little more magical. So, the 56mm for me is a lens that's all about isolation. It allows you to focus on a subject and remove distractions through depth of field or field of view. It also allows you to see the world in a way that others may not. Finally, there's the 75mm. Now everything I said about the 56mm is true here as well, but it's amplified by the longer focal length. The field of view is tighter, the working distances are longer, and the ability to use perspective distortion here is obviously reversed from the 27mm. Here, we're looking at things being pulled together much more than we observe them with our eyes. Let's start with that idea. The narrower field of view of the 75mm is much narrower than the 56mm, and it forces you to step back even more for the same subject size. That really adds to the feeling of objects in the final image being compressed together from front to back. For example, could you even hazard a guess as to how far apart the man, the building, and the tree are here on the depth plane? There's no real depth cues left in this image because of the working distance. The next thing you get from that extra working distance is the impersonal feeling that I spoke about in the beginning. This focal length forces you to be far enough away that it's noticeable to the viewer of your photographs. It feels like you're just at a distance stealing moments, and this is what really differentiates it from the 56mm in my opinion. The flip side of that is, however, that it allows you to pull distant things closer to the camera, and this makes it great for creating those impersonal feelings or getting compositions that you couldn't otherwise. I've really enjoyed using it at corporate events just for this reason. It allows me to keep my distance, for example from a speaker, so that I don't disturb the event, while I'm still able to get extremely shallow depth of field to focus on the speaker, and then frame them in a way that wouldn't be possible if I were closer with something like the 56mm. Finally, the thing I love about the 75mm is the way that the focus falls off. At certain focus distances, especially in close, it rolls off in a way that's very, very three-dimensional. A little bit like the feeling that I spoke about with the 27mm lens, but amplified. This is a feeling that I haven't been able to achieve with the 56mm f1.2 Pro. The 75mm for me is all about creating images that feel a little bit impersonal and isolating subjects from their surroundings in a more extreme way. It also has a special feeling when used in close that really helps it stand out from the other two lenses. So I hope this video has given you a better idea of the Pro series as a whole and what each lens might be good for. Before we finish up though, I want to take a moment to just appreciate what Viltrox has achieved here and talk about where I hope they might go next. What I love most about the Viltrox Pro line of lenses is that they've created a couple of unique options that simply didn't exist for Fujifilm X users. Incredibly fast 27 and 75mm lenses. Now these are both something quite special and they're unique to Viltrox. This really isn't something that a lot of third-party manufacturers are able to achieve, and I feel like Viltrox is slowly replacing Sigma in that way. They're priced like Sigma used to be, and they're pushing the boundaries like Sigma used to do. Viltrox is able to do more at a lower price point, and in the end, that's really good for us as consumers. Now, what I'd like to see in the future is a continuation of this line with some more useful focal lengths. Now, a 16mm f1.2, for example, would be absolutely amazing. A while back, I reviewed series 16mm f1.2, the sniper lens, and while I love the focal length and I love the rendering of a fast aperture at that focal length, the sniper lens just wasn't that sharp and it wasn't really reliable enough in terms of focus to make it a good tool for me. The 27mm, as I said in my review, feels like a bit of a halfway house between 23 and 33mm. It has the characteristics of both, but it's not strong in any particular direction. While the 27mm is my personal favorite of the Pro series of lenses, a 33mm would be absolutely stellar. So those are the two additions that I would like to see to this series, but I'd love to hear what you guys think and what you might want in the future in the comments below. Let's keep it sensible though. We'd all love a 10 to 200mm f1.2 that's sharp from corner to corner and weighs 500 grams, but physics will not allow that. What focal length would tick the boxes for you in the Pro series, and what would you use it for is what I'm really interested to hear. As always, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll enjoy the slideshow afterwards.